Hi everyone, welcome to today's masterclass with the Social Mobility Commission, the art of using storytelling to build inclusion. Today we are joined by a couple of people that I'm delighted can join us, and I've worked with these people in the past. I know you'll have they'll provide a fabulous insight into how you can use storytelling to really harness the power of storytelling to build inclusion. We are, if you could remain on mute throughout the workshop, and you can use the Q&A function to ask us questions. So there will be a slot available at the end where we can ask questions to the panelists. So if you've got anything as we go through, please do ask those questions. The webinar will be recorded and there are closed captions available. So if you go onto the panel on your screen, you'll be able to enable those should you require them. So today we are going to be talking about how we can harness the power of storytelling and create a culture within an organisation of inclusion and belonging. And storytelling is a really powerful tool to help colleagues understand challenges people face. It helps leaders to understand how they can support individuals and groups of people within an organisation. And it also helps to promote an inclusive and a trust-based culture. It doesn't have to be the comms person within your organisation. I know on the call today we've got people from social mobility networks within their organisations, we've got comms, we've got leaders, we've got HR people, D&I specialists, and everyone it can be used throughout the employee life cycle to really support and really drive home inclusive practices. So it can be used for as part of your apprenticeship and graduate scheme to encourage people to look at your organisation and early in careers. Talent programs, it can be used to encourage people to either join mentoring schemes or be a mentor for a mentor scheme. It can be really powerful, a powerful tool for people to understand what mentoring brings to individuals within an organisation. Likewise, any of your talent programs that you're doing, so the impact of talent programs had on an individual within your organisation. It can be used to showcase outreach activity that you've done. So all these activities that help support socioeconomic inclusion within an organisation. So for outreach, it could help encourage more people to volunteer and really see the impact some of the outreach programs that you're doing has. And even down to helping you understand why people would want to submit their data, so to collect data on people's individual backgrounds. And of course, all of the openness and trusting element to this and really builds, a culture of psychological safety. So we are going to be talking very shortly with Simon from Iambic, who will be giving us a bit more of an overview in terms of what storytelling is all about, how to frame it, what sort of do's and don'ts, and a kind of a whistle stop tour of some of the tools and tricks of his trade. And then we'll be joined by Odo Noel from Santander, who we'll be talking about how it's worked in practice within their organisation. And of course, then there's also your questions and next steps and at the end, and where we'll share some more resources. So I'm delighted that we're joined today by Simon Arrowsmith of Iambic Creative. He's the co-founder of Iambic Creative. They're a storytelling and communications agency, and he works with individuals, teams and brands to find and craft and share their business stories and to help them connect, sell and inspire. He's a leading business story consultant and coach, and he's worked globally with large brands, including Sony Pictures, Warner Music and Nestle, and with internationally renowned speakers, so from global CEOs to Olympians. So he believes that narrative storytelling remain the core tools across corporate communications and brand storytelling. So welcome, Simon, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Paul. It's absolutely brilliant to be here. Thanks for including me. So I thought I'd start Hopefully you can all see that, by showing a little bit about why I'm the person talking to you and a little bit about my story. So yes, I run this organization called Iambic Creative. Paula has done a brilliant job of introducing me, so I won't repeat that. But my story with Story started quite long ago. I should say that the other person in this picture, I'm the one with the glasses. The other person is my husband. He's also my business partner, Johnny, and we run the company together. But we've done that for 13 years, but I've been working with stories for, well, decades. I started my career in theatre, not as an actor, more of as a writer, composer, and a director. And that was great. I loved theatre. I still love theatre, but I also like food and having a roof over my head. And I was very kind of aware of the fact that perhaps a career in theatre was something that was for very few people going to be successful. So I quickly thought, I know, I need to go and get a job. So I moved into the civil service, was my first big job. And then from there, I went into various organizations, starting out in HR, learning and development, and then moving into communications, internal comms. And then 13 years ago, I sort of found myself in this position where I really wanted to use some of the theatrical stuff, some of the story stuff, because, you know, when you study theatre, when you study how plays work, you really spend a lot of time focusing on these story and storytelling elements. And I wanted to know how I could use that in business. Unfortunately, I met some people who were already doing it. They introduced me to the techniques, and that's been the last 13 years. So I want to share a few things with you. This is the journey we're going to go on for the next 15, 20 minutes. I want to instill the idea about why you should care about story. I think story has a bad reputation, as it were. We think of it as only useful for certain things, but I want to change your mind on that. I want to look at how story works with the brain. We'll briefly touch on what's going on inside this thing and why stories matter. We'll then shift our focus to, well, what does that mean for the workplace and how storytelling can help there? I then wanted to give you an example of the shape of story and how knowing that structure, knowing that pattern can be really, really helpful to you in lots of different situations. And then the last thing I want to, and probably the most important thing, is thinking about this idea of why story is important for inclusion. Why does it matter? So kind of linking back to why we should care. So let's ask this question: why story? Well, fundamentally, it's because it's how we are seeing the world. This is the lens that we view the world through. It's how we create meaning in our lives, or mattering. It's how we actually, create it in the brain. It's related to how we see others and empathize, and then move beyond empathy, which I'll talk about in a minute. When we see characters and different situations, we want to put ourselves in the shoes of those people. And it's also about how we gain insight when we make a connection in the brain through these story and storytelling tools. It's actually where we imagine things and create things that perhaps we hadn't thought of before and make these connections. So it's actually an incredibly important set of tools. It's way more than just communication. It's very important for communication. As someone who does comms for a living, I'm very passionate about it there. But its uses are so much more than that. So let me spend a little bit of time talking about why that is and what's going on in between our ears and in our brains. I call it the story smarts. We have a series of tools that help us light up more of our brain when we use or are exposed to stories. So when we are just having simple facts thrown at us, which, let's face it, in business, we get that a lot. It's a lot of information. We're getting information overload. We're actually only lighting up the parts of the brain that deal with comprehension and language. When we hear a story, the brain is lighting up the parts that deal with empathy and our history, our personal histories, our physical, our sort of experiences of our lives. Not only that, but when we hear a story, we get lots of lovely hormones released. We get oxytocin released and dopamine. And dopamine is particularly useful because it is a neurotransmitter. So that's why you can remember a story when it's connected to an emotional context, and you can remember a story years in the future, or in the past, I guess, a story from years ago, and you might have difficulty remembering a financial report from, say, 2 hours ago. Those connections, that dopamine, that release of hormones, helps us build stronger brain connections to the information. So not only are we using stories in our brain to practice, to rehearse how things might be in the future with our experience, we are going backwards and thinking about what's our experience been to date when we hear and engage with stories. Well, not only that, are we listening to others and experiencing them and putting ourselves in their shoes, we're actually making physical connections. And there are a host of other things that I won't go into right now, but one thing that I find really interesting is the way that your storyteller, your brain as a storyteller, is desperate to close information gaps. Here's a little example of this. This is a film from the 1940s, a silent film, so you won't be able to hear it. It was an experiment by a couple called Hyder and Simmel. And what they discovered is when people watch this film, they cannot help but place a story, a narrative, and a series of storytelling elements onto it. The challenge becomes that this information that you're seeing on your screen now isn't enough. We don't have enough information to have a consistent story when we experience it. Some people, when I run this in workshops, some people see this as a child tormenting a grumpy neighbor. Some people see it as a love tryst, as a triangle. Some people literally see it as just triangles and circles. But most people will put some kind of emotional context, some kind of story. They will layer it. Their brain will layer it. A story's always being told. I guess it's about, are you the one telling it, or is someone else telling your story? And I think that becomes really important, particularly when you're talking about marginalized people and people who we want to get the most out of in work and include more. If we're not telling our stories, then someone else is. I'll share a link to that so you can have a look at it in more detail. So the brain is desperate to close those story gaps, so it will fill in information. So I think, we have to own our stories, and the way to do it is to really understand how they're built, how they come together, and how we can experience them. So that brings us on to how stories are used in the workplace. And I use these terms quite deliberately. Story is made up of a number of different parts. And for me, there are 3 key areas. I think the challenge is we use these terms interchangeably. For me, that's a problem because they do have different roles. Narrative is all about the sort of fundamental why of who I am, what I'm about. And this doesn't necessarily have to be as a human. It could be, what's my campaign about? What's my message? What's my core message about? That's the narrative. It's that overarching direction of travel. Sitting on top of that, we have these things called stories, which are shapes that the brain responds to in a very specific way. It's a pattern, if you like. And then on top of that, so we're still including the narrative and the stories, comes storytelling. That's the communication tools, the metaphors, the detail, the language we would use, the visual imagery we would choose, the music we would choose. I separate these out because I think in business, we seem to have become comfortable with very transactional storytelling. And I'd like to invite you to start practicing more transformational storytelling, transformational stories, and transformational narratives. So on this diagram that you can see before you, at the bottom, at the base there, narrative is all about, do I understand myself? Have I got confidence on myself? Am I clear-minded? Do I understand how my thinking is work about, for example, in this scenario, my identity? Stories is about, can I connect that from outside of myself to others using this pattern, which I'm going to share with you shortly. And then finally, do I make that engaging and interesting so people will listen? Do I understand my audience so that I can bring them in through communication? So these, funny enough, I think you could think of this almost as, if you've seen the work of Simon Sinek, it's the narrative is the why, the stories is the how, and the storytelling is the what. Very similar to that thinking. But I think we need to move beyond this term of just storytelling. Storytelling is the tip of the mountain. It's the stuff we see. There's so much more going on beneath. And that's where, particularly for inclusion, the really good stuff happens. So I'm going to talk about the shape of stories, but I thought it would be useful for you to hear one of my stories. So the story I'm thinking of in particular, you know, I'm thinking about a story that's important for inclusion, to demonstrate how stories are powerful for inclusion. And I was thinking about how we all live in our own little bubbles, don't we? And I had a good experience of this not so long ago, of people who live in a bubble, me included, and the worldview that we sort of grow through that bubble. My parents live in France. They moved out about 12 years ago. And they have a lovely community out there that's a mix of French and English people. And when they first moved out there, they met their neighbors, their English-speaking neighbors, and they went round and had a lovely meal and got to know them. And then during the course of the meal, one member of the couple made a homophobic slur. It was just quite a casual remark. It was just something that came from their view of the world, something that they had been perhaps educated around, or the way they'd been exposed to media had said this was okay to say. And of course, my mum, having a gay son, the hackles went up, and it was like, I'm not sure I'm comfortable. And she politely said, I would rather you didn't use that language. My son is gay, and he is married to a man, and they will be coming to visit, and I want them to feel comfortable. So, of course, flash forward to the first visit when we go out there and we go and meet the neighbors. And to begin with, this story's been shared with me. There's a little bit of anxiety. What's this going to be like? And during the course of a couple of glasses of wine, the conversation turns and we start talking about our identities. And these people are all of a sudden open and fascinated and interested in me as a person. And one of the reasons I think that was because we were talking about holidays and booking holidays. And I shared with them just a short story about how when my partner and I book holidays, we're very selective about where we go, because we're very conscious about where we may be able to go and where we won't feel safe going. And that was something he had never considered before. He just went, that's amazing. And of course, that opened up other discussions. And that in turn turned to much more trust between us. And now it would not be a trip to my parents if we didn't go and spend time with the neighbors. Our families have all met one another. It's all become we've become very close. And so that has moved the needle for them from being quite in their bubble, isolated, not being experienced of my community and my experience, to me sharing a short story with them or sharing my experience. And all of a sudden, we're in a very, very different place, which is quite lovely, really. So, that's just me sharing my experience. But if you listen, it is shaped as a story. Stories are really simple. I think part of the problem we have with stories is they are so simple. They are so a part of who we are as human beings. That shape we're so used to it. We see it in all our entertainment. We actually see it in our daily lives. And as I said, the brain is already using these tools all the time to create and understand meaning. A story is fundamentally, it is the beginning, middle, and end. It's certainly one of the ways that we interpret it. But the beginning, middle, and end of a story tends to have similar parts. So the beginning is all about a setup. A hero wants something in the world. There's something missing. Then the middle of the story tends to be a bit of a difficult period of time. Something gets in her way. She can't quite achieve the thing that she thought she wanted. And then the end, well, the end of a good story is there's some sort of resolution. They've overcome, they've got over some obstacles. They've achieved the goal. Maybe it wasn't the goal they set out with to begin with, but it's certainly some kind of resolution. So that beginning, middle, and end, I like to replace with challenge, struggle, resolution, and just start thinking in that way about how I craft my communications, how I connect with other people, just very conscious that that's the way my brain is thinking already, and that's probably the way their brain is thinking, if the research is true. And there's a lot of research that sort of demonstrates this. We can take it further and deeper. You know, fundamentally, this is about a character, a hero, who's going along a plot, a journey, and engages in this conflict. It's all problems and solutions, until they get to the resolution. And most often, this is described as the 3-act structure. We'll be sharing these slides afterwards, so please feel free to use them. This is all very out there, and as you'll probably recognize, it is the way you think when you think about story. The beginning is all about that setup, the challenge, the world, the context, the environment. Do we understand why we're here? Then there are these other elements that push us into the next part of the story. So from the challenge, there's then an inciting event that pushes you into a period of struggle, and the struggle moves and moves up until you get to this key moment that then leads to resolution. So if we think about the short story I shared, the setup was all about my parents moving to France, a different environment, wanting to move, make friends. The inciting event was the moment where the neighbor made a homophobic slur. The struggle was then, well, there's quite a bit of struggle in that story. There's a struggle for me as someone moving into that environment, and do I feel safe, and how am I going to address this? There was the struggle for my mum, who wanted to defend her child in that environment. There was the struggle for the people who'd said the thing, to think about, rethink their thinking, reframe their thinking, to see the world differently, and to go through something that they have been programmed to believe is one way, and all of a sudden they're being shown something different. The climactic event was our visit, when we all got to meet, and finally I gave an example there where I talked about some of the struggles we face, however small they are, and the resolution is great. We have this lovely relationship now. It's really, really exciting and friendly, and you know, we wouldn't go and not see them. So that is the fundamental shape that I'd encourage you to start thinking about when you think about stories. Pixar put it a slightly different way. It's quite nice that, you know, the setup, challenge, inciting event, struggle, climax, and resolution is all about once, or for Pixar, it's once upon a time. There's this environment, there's this world, and every day the hero has this series of challenges or wants this thing, until one day this thing happens. And because of that thing, there's all this period of struggle. Because of that struggle, they climb and climb and climb until they reach the top. And that climax then gives them until finally the resolution. So it's a pattern. It's a really, really straightforward and simple pattern, but it is there in our lives all the time. And that's why it's so important for us when we're talking about this world, when we're talking about revealing a little bit more about ourselves, including others in our story, and sharing who we are so that people can understand us. There's this thing about when we use story for any purpose, but particularly for inclusion, I think we fall into this trap of being generic, of trying to tell too big a story. The story I chose, the story that I shared with you very deliberately, because it's about one group of people, one small group of people, and meeting another group of people, and how one person changed another person's or few people's point of view. It isn't about a big story. You know, our brains perhaps can't take in all this information. We want something small. So Stories for Inclusion starts by this personal storytelling of sharing who we are. I think that's useful because it gains or helps people gain clarity to understand ourselves and understand each other more clearly. I think it also ensures that we're not seeing groups of people as their group, that we're seeing them as individuals who have experiences that are partly to do with their identity and the way that they've been brought up, etc. So it does gain us clarity. It allows for connection, and therefore allows us to start to build trust with one another. When we don't understand, or we don't see how people are, or understand people, that gap that I explored very quickly earlier, that is filled with stories. And those are our stories, the listeners' stories, that fills the gap. And often those stories are negative stories. They're not They're not positive. We other people. So by sharing our stories, by helping people to see who we are, we can make stronger and better connections. And I think stories have the ability to move us beyond empathy, from empathy into compassion. And what I mean by that is it's great to be able to see the world from someone else's shoes, but what are you going to do about it? For me, compassion is the ability, the need to act, that the empathy is so strong that you want to act upon it in a positive way. And I think stories really are the heart of that. So let's just quickly explore a couple of tools that I would advise you to start exploring and thinking about. The first one, of course, is that story shape that I shared. Start thinking about how your communications, whether you are a group who's trying to share your identity, or you're the individual who wants people to see more of who you are. Think about the story. The key part of that is, and these are the storytelling tools, is all around your character, your characteristics. What is it about you as an individual, your characteristics, not the characteristics of type, but your characteristics and how specific they are. And I would say, be detailed. If you can, be specific. We like I can't say this word, specificity in our stories. We like the detail. We hook onto it. Again, people worry that, oh, well, it's not going to reach an audience if I need to be more general to include everyone. Well, I think actually you need to be very specific about your story. Other people will find their way in. The more honest and clear you are with your story about your description of your character and the problem, the conflict you face, the clearer it is, and therefore people will be able to connect to it. The other thing to think about is the tone of your story and the space in which you're telling it. It's your story. You have to be careful with it. Sometimes it's not going to be safe to share that story, and you need to make that assessment. One of the things I in workshops that I run, we talk about is what's the safe space, what's the safe environment for a story. Can we start to build better places in the workplace where people can feel comfortable sharing this stuff? So we have to check and make sure that for us it's safe to share our story. It's our story. We need to own it. And part of that might be that you need to test the waters with your tone. You might want to blurt out your big story about who you are and why it's important. And that might meet with resistance because your tone is not appropriate. You haven't moved through sort of stages of rapport, if you like, and worked with someone to really pull them into your world. So think about the tone. Start small, baby steps, step by step, until people are more open and will access your story more easily. The other thing I think about is this idea about where are stories told in the workplace. My preference is for smaller environments so that you avoid this kind of big broadcast moment. Think about stories to one to two, 1 to 3 people. Keep it small, keep it intimate, so that people can feel safer in telling those stories. And then for story listeners, I think it's really important to start considering, how do you build those open environments where people are ready and open to listening to a different story, a story of difference. And that's all about not unconscious bias, but so much of, I think it's more about actual biases. In our brain, we have to acknowledge the worlds we've come from and put them in check, and recognize when we're listening to a story, what am I doing here? How am I listening to this story? How am I closing myself off and not being open to this story? I talk about this thing called the binary check. There's in the brain, when we hear the word good, our brain flicks very, very, very quickly to the word bad. And it does this for every single thing. It puts it in binary all the time. If we're aware that that's happening, we can start to open ourselves up, calm ourselves down, and place ourselves on a binary check and go, hold on, I put that person into I've pigeonholed them. I've put them into a hole because it helps my brain cope. It's not necessarily the truth. We need to open ourselves up and engage with, traditional listening tools about focus and attention, and really giving people space to speak when they're telling their story, so that we can hear the truth of it. I think story and the story pattern itself can be a really powerful listening tool. If you know that you're listening for a plot line, if you know you're listening for characteristics, and you know you're listening for perhaps conflict points, it will put you in focus, and hopefully you'll be more open to the stories of other people. So that really was a whistle-stop tour. I'm just very conscious I've just blurted out at you, but hopefully it made some kind of sense, and hopefully it was of interest. So yeah, thank you for letting me speak. Back to you, Paula.
Brilliant. Thanks, Simon. That's great. We've had a few people say, "Oh, are you sharing?" And you've obviously suggested we'll be sharing that information and that pack. And I think that, you know, the building beyond empathy to compassion is something that's obviously really key in inclusion, in terms of the need to act. So you need to do something differently, or you need to help or support others to be able to do something differently. So that's fabulous. So we'll explore a bit what you've been talking about, and thank you for sharing your own story as well, when we ask Odo to join us. So Odo is the Santander's Senior Innovation Partner, and she's the Tri-Chair of their Social Mobility Network. She's dual race Scottish Nigerian, and so as a result, she always strives to create a fair and inclusive workplace, and has a deep passion to combine innovation skills with purpose, so to deliver products and services that deliver financial well-being for Santander's customers. In addition to the day job, and there's probably a few of you on the call that's very similar to this, in terms of you also have your other job, which is part of a network. After founding the first ethnicity network in Santander, she's now the Tri-Chair of their Social Mobility Network, and works with a fantastic team to deliver initiatives for colleagues and young people driving change for the better. So thank you for joining us, Odo. So Odo, I'm going to ask you the first question, if that's okay. So I'd like to ask if you could share with us the first time you, as your role within the Social Mobility Network, decided to share your own personal story. How did that come about, and sort of how did you gauge what to share? And then what impact did you see it having? You're on mute, Odo.
Sorry, thank you very much. And Simon, I loved what you were describing as well. It was really interesting, and it just provides a framework, which I think is really valuable. So Paul, as you say, I'm a Scottish Nigerian, so it's either my Scottish side or my Nigerian side, but communication is high on my agenda because I know the impact it has. So just to answer your question, I'll take you back to a couple of years ago. We just started the Social Mobility Network, and we were putting a lot of awareness comms out. But what we noticed was there was a real lack of understanding of what on earth social mobility was about. And I'm sure a lot of people on the call that are involved in social mobility have gone through this experience as well. We had people coming to us and saying, "Oh, I thought you were talking about social media, or I thought you were talking about mobility and disability, etc." So all those phrases, those sentences, etc., they just weren't cutting through. So me and one of the chairs at the time, we decided to actually try and make it a little bit more relatable. And we agreed to share our own personal, pretty raw stories, because we thought actually what we've been appealing to is people's heads, but not their heart. So we said, well, we can't expect other people to do what we haven't done. So we kind of put on our parachute, had a few sessions together, and we decided that, okay, we're going to share our real story. We're real people with real stories. So we agreed to do a video, and really just kind of like very informal, just almost like interview each other. It was really nerve-wracking, I will not lie. It was so nerve-wracking, because what you got to remember when you're talking about people that have come from pretty challenging background is that we've spent a lot of time, and we've become really skilled at burying that when we come into the office. So it's not a natural thing for anyone to do, is to talk about disadvantage, challenges, etc. We want to all put on our masks, etc., and kind of present ourselves as, you know, the polished article. So what we did was that we really exposed our vulnerabilities, and we had to look at some painful memories, because even though you might be talking to family, friends, etc., this is work colleagues. So it was majorly outside our comfort zone. we did put a lot of guardrails up. So we defined what our red lines were. So between the two of us, we were like, I'm not going to talk about this, so don't ask me anymore, don't probe in that area. And she was saying, don't ask me too much about this. So we defined what our red lines were, and we made sure that we kind of stuck to that. And I think that's fair enough, you know. So we basically did it in one take, which was quite good because it meant we didn't have to keep on going over it. We couldn't watch it back. I felt like I wanted to hide under a pillow, and just kind of like went into mild panic of like, what have I done? And also, I'll be honest with you, I felt quite guilty as well, because I thought I don't want this to become or feel like a sympathy story or I don't want people's sympathy. I thought, you know, I came from a very loving family, and yeah, we didn't have much, but we had a lot of love, etc. So we had financial poverty, not love poverty, if that makes sense. So yeah, that's how we did it. And what we didn't expect was the overwhelming positive reaction that we got. So a number of people actually reached out to us and said how much it touched them, which really had an impact on me. Some were talking about actually they hadn't felt confident or comfortable about sharing their story. They'd done what we'd done, which is just spent our careers kind of just putting that into a box and keeping it over there. But also what really touched me was people that were actually not from a disadvantaged background. Some of them had watched it as well, and they said that it had an impact on them because they really believe in fairness, you know, giving equal chances, etc. So there was a real openness, or it kind of galvanized a bit of a conversation with people to say, look, I might not be from this background, but actually I want to get involved to also be part of the solution as well. So that's kind of like our first toe in the water, I would probably describe that as, and it was pretty uncomfortable, way outside of our comfort zone.
But powerful.
Yeah, it seemed to have do you know what, I'll tell you, I'll really be honest, because it had an impact not just on others, but it had an impact on us. Yeah. And this is where I think is really important for us to understand, is that when you ask people to share their own personal stories, you have to take them on a bit of a journey. I had to look at my own personal story first and come to terms with that, and then decide how I wanted to present that out to others. But I had to look at it for me first of all, and I think that's a really important learning.
No, that's brilliant. Thank you for sharing that, and that's great to hear. And obviously, I was at Santander when you were going through this as well, so I remember the impact it had on everyone. So, and something you mentioned there in terms of you know, the also people without the lived experience being able to understand from where you're coming from. So Simon, I just wanted you mentioned it a bit in some of your presentation, but we know one of the main benefits of storytelling is the ability to shift perspectives and allow others to understand how they can support. And Odo obviously had people reaching out saying that that's what they wanted to do. How can we get involved? How can we be part of the solution? Can you go into a little bit more detail about how best to do that and to encourage people to consider putting themselves in other shoes? Is there any tools or tricks or?
Well, I think there's sort of two sides to it, really. The first side is, as the story, if you're the one sharing your story, it goes back to that, don't be afraid of the detail. Be specific, help people see and feel the experience. But I think, as Odo said quite clearly, you have to work on that story first yourself, work on yourself before you work on others. So if you're the one sharing the story, and for people who are listening to the story, it does come down to some really simple things about openness, but I think it's about that check the binaries, check the biases that you hold, and being okay with that and going, hold on, my experience and my background has led me to this point. My world, I see the world this way. That's my worldview. Be open to be challenged about that and ask, how can I change that view? How can I move and be different? I think it's about those two players of the storyteller, the person sharing the story, has to engage with the right amount of detail and specifics. The listeners have to really get into their openness to be able to recognize when they're hearing a story, what's going on for them as an individual.
Brilliant, thank you. And Odo, have you seen that in practice? Have you seen people change their view and And
Yeah,
have you got any examples you want to share with us?
I do. Again, you know, another colleague of mine. So what happened was that he actually watched the video, and he emailed us that night, and his email literally said, "How can I help?" And what he explained was that he said it was the authentic nature of our stories that connected with him and his own personal background, and it was also the passion that he could kind of get from us. So he said, he actually said to himself, and this is where the perspective changed. He actually said to himself, why don't I have a new perspective, which is, imagine that if we could all inspire one person the way that he felt inspired by watching that. And incidentally, he's now one of the chairs of the Social Mobility Network. So a complete shift that's happened.
Brilliant. And like you say, being part of the change, like, so moving that far forward in his perspective to actually then provide solutions. So that's great, fabulous to hear. You've obviously expressed, you've told us a bit about how difficult it is for people to open up. Were there any other specific challenges you faced? And for instance, if there's others on the call who feel like they want to, who are feeling challenged to share their story, what advice could you give that would help them?
Well, I mean, I'll tell you a very personal situation that just happened, kind of a live example very recently. So I was meeting with an executive level leader to talk about social mobility, and I put on this, so it was my turn to do the intro, and I put on this very important posh business speak about the reasons why social mobility is vital, etc. It then moved on to the next person, and I just had this massive overwhelming feeling of like, you're such a fake. So I actually said to them, look, I'm really sorry, but could I do my introduction again? Because what I hadn't shared with them was the true why behind the reason why I thought social mobility is important. So I took a deep breath, and I shared my honest backstory. You know, the fact of growing up and not having enough, you know, having a lot of food scarcity, heating scarcity, clothing scarcity, every scarcity that you can ever, you know, you can imagine. Being the youngest of, you know, 5 children, my mum losing her husband, and all of us being under 11. So my mum being out, you know, as a cleaner and having to work seriously long hours, and, you know, just the conflicts, the lack, the struggles, etc. But also the ups, which was, you know, school was great for me, grabbing every opportunity that I could. I was the first one, and I'm the youngest, the first of 5 to go to uni. Started working at 14, you know, those kind of things, because what I wanted to convey was that this isn't all about having a sad story. It's really not. It's having an honest story, and actually understanding that the only way you can change the status quo is if you understand that people coming from a disadvantaged background have much more obstacles and hurdles that they have to climb over. But nobody can understand that if everyone acts as though it's a level playing field as well. So in that interaction, I actually felt myself really welling up, but I think I managed to hold it together. So I was quite surprised at how open I was. Anyway, that senior leader really encouraged me, because he sent me a message afterwards, and he said, you know what, a sign of a good leader is to allow yourself to be vulnerable. And he, you know, he wanted to know more. He was interested in hearing more, and he himself has such a powerful and inspiring backstory as well. Because, you know, look, at the end of the day, you know, we're talking about social mobility. It's often very challenging stories that people are sharing. There could be shame. I felt shame. I felt embarrassment. It was pretty raw as well. We have to recognize that when we're asking people to share their stories. But what I learned was, and my advice would be that take it in small bits. Take it in, you know, bite-sized chunks. Just decide what you want to share. Start with you and understand your story. Decide where your red lines are, you know, what I'm not going to talk about, and get comfortable with the uncomfortable. But don't keep that story inside. Somebody that I'll share with you shortly, but somebody that we worked with before, she said, you know, your story is powerful. It's not to be hidden. It should be shared. But how can you share your true self if you haven't looked in the mirror and actually understood what your story is and articulated it? And lastly, just be courageous. You know, we've trained ourselves to hide our stories. You'll be surprised. You really will, at the support and the positive response. And my last tip would be, like, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, phone a friend. You know, you don't have to do this by yourself. Find a buddy, find somebody that you can practice on, or you can do it together. Because when you speak your truth, actually it's quite empowering.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Odo. That's great to hear, actually. And like you say, yeah, you're not alone out there. There are people who will help you share your story. So if you don't know how to do it, then, you know, speak to comms professionals as well, and or people within your organisation or social mobility networks, etc. Simon, we know the language used within storytelling is a powerful tool, but it can also obviously trip people up. And you talked about obviously the homophobic slur that tripped up the you know, your parents' neighbours, and it can, you know, cause miscommunication or difficulty or anxiety, etc. So great to hear more on how people could should think about the language they use to allow for a higher impact, just while sort of ensuring respect and psychological safety.
Yeah. I think in this kind of storytelling, it's quite different. I mean, in the sort of communications world, we're always taught that, you know, it's all about the flashy headline to grab attention, that people are attention poor. But I think in this story, you know, particularly listening to exactly what Odo said, you know, with authentic storytelling, you've got to give people the space, and sometimes that takes time. And so it's using language that doesn't perhaps engage the shame filter for them as well as for you immediately. You know, you want people to open, to learn from the story, and so your kind of role in this is to try and help them find their way in. I think the other thing is to think about don't use too much hyperbole, don't over egg the pudding. I loved what Odo was saying about, it's not about the misery in the story, it's about the joy in the story. That can be just as powerful, if not more so, to help people see the situation and move. Yeah, so I think it's all about recognizing where you start from and how your language might connect to somebody else. You as the storyteller, trying to see the world from their point of view as well, to help them to use language that will match them and match their world, their view of the world, so you can bring them closer to you.
Yeah, brilliant. We often are, when we say use storytelling to collect data, people say, well, should we say working class? Should we say low socioeconomic background? And I say, ask the organisation, ask the people that you're talking to, because they're the ones that are going to listen to it, and they're the ones it's about. So that's what, you know, you need to include everyone to kind of come to that common census. So that's brilliant. And we've got quite a number of questions. Sorry, Simon, were you going to say something?
I would just on that point, it's really interesting. I come across quite a lot of, you can't say this anymore kind of thing. My response to that is always, you probably never should have been saying it in the first place. And if that's the filter, that's your view of the world, I can't say this. Have you ever spoken to someone who you are addressing or talking about to see how they describe the situation, what their story is? So sorry, I just wanted to.
No, that's brilliant. Fantastic. Thank you. We've got quite a few questions in the Q&A. So I've got one last one for Odo, and then I'm going to jump to some of the questions in the Q&A. So now that you've incorporated storytelling into your work at Santander, what shifts have you seen towards the understanding of improving social mobility at Santander?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the biggest shift has been, so we work with an organisation called LEAD, and we've been doing that over the last few years through the Social Mobility Network, but now also through the Black Inclusion Plan. And the biggest shift has been, so they run a module on, you know, storytelling, and you actually being able to articulate your story and then be able to share it. And it's had two profound effects for social mobility. One, which is that there's a greater number of colleagues who have actually been inspired, they've gone from, I don't have a story, I don't have anything of value really to offer, certainly from my background, to people that have actually gone and presented to senior leader panels and presented their stories. So the impact has been on the colleague, and they've actually been on a journey, and many of them have gone on to do amazing things afterwards. But it's also been on the panel as well, you know, those business leaders in the business who have actually heard real raw stories and have actually understood that this isn't some theoretical thing, but it's actually a shift that's happening across the business at all levels, to say this is something that is so fundamental if we get this right, all these other areas are going to be impacted as well. So, we're a network of, we've got about 700 people in our network, but actually we've got a lot of advocates that are in senior management positions. People are much more active in the social mobility network who are willing to actually share their own stories now as well, as a result of kind of working with Lead on that. So I'm seeing a mindset shift and a relatability shift of why is this important as well, because social mobility is not really understood. So I'm seeing a really big difference happening because we are focused on telling your story and people listening to other stories as well.
Brilliant. And that, I guess that also plays into not only from a workplace, from an employee perspective, but also into, into your day job, which is like the products and solutions for individuals. So financial inclusion, that kind of thing as well, is having that impact on everyone across the business.
Yeah, I mean, we've actually had business leaders that I've spoken to a couple of people recently, and they've said, within my business line, what can I do?
Yeah.
And how can I bring social mobility into that, which just blew my mind. Oftentimes you're always talking about the individual, but they're like, no, how as we as a business can we start building this as well? So we're in an early stage of it, but it's that mindset shift.
Yeah.
Of thinking, how can you do things differently?
It's great to hear. So thank you for both sharing. I'm going to ask a few questions that have come in. So there's one that came in very early on when you were talking, Simon. It says, how does storytelling change when the story or the struggle isn't over? And I don't know if you saw that in the Q&A, but I thought that was quite interesting.
Yeah, I mean, you can only tell the story you've got. And I guess the end of the story becomes how you would like the story to end, what your ideal would be. I guess the thing is that there's always mini stories within your wider story. You still may be living it and still may be experiencing it, and that full resolution hasn't happened. But what's another one? What's, if you're living an experience that isn't helpful, what is it about you that has resolved rather than the situation? So I've learned that I need to do more of this, or I've learned that this is how I will change in future when I speak to other people who aren't respecting me, for example, something like that.
Yeah, brilliant. I was thinking that, I think for a lot of people, and until you're in the position you want to be, you may not feel that your stories, and none of our stories are over until
there's only one way it ends.
Yeah. The fat lady sings, as they say. Another question is, I feel that we could prep the audiences to be non-judgmental, shift their frame of reference on life. What advice might you have on this? So if I go to you first, Simon, then maybe Odo, you've got something as well you could think about.
I think we can prep the audience, but I think the way to do that is to help them understand how this wonderful thing between our ears is working. And as I say, the more we understand the power of storytelling in the brain, the more we as individuals can go, oh, that's why that's happening. That's why I'm reacting the way I'm reacting, because this is being triggered. That's happening. If we get our audiences to understand that more, they will, I believe they will be more receptive to some of this stuff.
Brilliant. Odo, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Simon touched on it earlier. I think that an audience it should be two-way. So, I agree with what Simon's saying in terms of trying to start small and make sure it's not a broadcast, but it's a conversation. So, if you are going to go to a really big audience, how do you level that down so that there's an opportunity for them to get involved and kind of be part of that conversation? Because you don't change minds through just broadcasting. You change minds by having a dialogue, understanding where they're coming from. So if the audience is small enough, get them to talk, get them to feedback what they're thinking, get them to react in some way.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's why that word storytelling is so unhelpful sometimes, because we feel like it's telling. It should be story sharing or something that is more, absolutely, is more collaborative.
Yeah, absolutely. Someone said they're really shy and this can affect the impact of what they're trying to say. Sometimes how they say something completely undermines what they say, although that's the only voice they have. Do you have any tips? So anyone who's feeling quite shy about telling their story.
Odo, do you have anything?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, I think that it's sometimes it's perceived that, you know, you have to be an extrovert to tell your story. I've watched, because there's been like hundreds of people that have gone through this recent program, I've watched people that are incredibly shy come out the other side totally different. But it is a process. I think you have to take baby steps, and that builds your confidence. You know, even if it's just, you know, I'm going to say something, one thing for the next week, or for the next, you know, the next 5 sessions that I'm in, or whatever, and then I'll add another one. Or but just allow yourself to take the baby steps that you're comfortable with, and then celebrate the fact that you've done it, because it builds up your confidence, and then you feel as though I can take another little step, and then another little step. But don't expect yourself to go from A to Z, you know, in 30 seconds. Just baby steps.
Baby steps. Yeah. And I think you'd also said, in terms of, you know, trying it out with other people. So find 100%. The language that's comfortable for you by trying it out with other people, and how does that fit comfortably, you know, and the more authentic it is and true to your story, and not in the language of someone else, the more I think you are then able to feel comfortable sharing what you are sharing. So Simon, have you got anything else to add on that?
No, I would completely echo what Oda said. Is I would also say that it's just find places to practice it and do it in everyday life. It's like, if you've got to present something, try and make other communications a little bit like a presentation. And the more and more you do it, the easier it becomes, because your brain is creating that pattern towards the easy pathway. So the more, you know, you feel like you can't tell a story, just tell it in a small way, and, you know, build like that. I think it's great. That's
brilliant. Thank you. Sadly, I think we're nearly out of time, and I could go on and talk about it for everyone. We've got quite a few questions. So any questions we've not been able to answer, we're going to ask our speakers to have a look at those, and we'll share those as part of our recap. But I just want to thank both Odo and Simon for coming on and sharing. I've definitely had a dopamine hit, Simon, today. I think everyone on the call has, and Odo, you know, great to hear how what you're doing at Santander is really kind of improving things for not only your fellow colleagues, but also how it's impacting on the community you work with as well. So I just want to thank you both for being part of today, and thank you for your time on behalf of colleagues. So I'm just going to share my screen just to say what else we've got coming up. So we do have a couple of more events. So tied in, I think, with storytelling is we've got a couple of speakers coming to speak about accents in the workplace. So, you know, that they will be sharing challenges and case studies. People have talked about how how their accent is being perceived where they work. And then we're also doing some work. We've got Career Ready and a couple of employers they work with who are going to be coming to speak to us about outreach. As I've said before, we've got a number of resources, and we'll share the resources in the pack that Simon shared earlier, and the resources that we've got. So we've got our Let's Talk About class. So you know, it could be that this forms part of the storytelling of individuals forms part of a wider conversation in your organisation. But for the time being, just like to once again thank our two speakers for being so open and honest and sharing their wonderful insights. And as Odo said, you know, you want to reach people's hearts, as you know, not just their heads, and I think storytelling, as they've shown, really helps kind of drive change in organisations and makes people think differently and want to do something. So thank you for joining us today, and yeah, we'll see you at the next one. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.